Welcome along. It's Saturday afternoon. I'm Justin Briley, your host for the next hour and a half here on Premier Christian Radio, with the programme Unbelievable, bringing together Christians and non-Christians as usual for discussion and debate. But plenty more to come on Premier this afternoon. If you want to listen in after 4 o'clock, you'll find Dave and B with Hip Rock UK, the latest in youth news and Christian music. So do stay tuned for that. You may be listening, though, online via our podcast. That's at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. You're very welcome as well. Well, it's an exciting week coming up for Catholics in the UK as Pope Benedict XVI visits on an official state visit, but there are people who aren't so happy about the fact that he's here at the taxpayers' expense. We're going to be meeting one of them in the course of today's programme, and a young Catholic apologist. Let me introduce you to them now.
You're unbelievable.
We're debating on the programme today, is the Catholic Church a force for good or evil in the world? A similar proposal was debated at Westminster Central Hall at an Intelligence Squared debate between people like Stephen Fry, Christopher Hitchens, Anne Widdecombe, and a Catholic Archbishop, that was Oni Aiken. So we're looking at the question afresh today and asking, what about the things that the Catholic Church is accused of in regards to child abuse, attitudes towards HIV/AIDS in Africa, past historic torture, things like that. Is there any defence for these things? Can, if you like, the Catholic Church be called a force for good in the world? We'll be hearing in the course of today's programme from the British Humanist Association director Andrew Copson, who's also part of the Protest the Pope coalition. He says the Catholic Church is not overall a force for good in the world. We'll also be hearing from Peter D. Williams. He's a young Catholic apologist. He is a theologian, and he's part of the Catholic Voices group, who are, if you like, providing media-friendly spokespersons in support of the Catholic Church in the time that Pope Benedict XVI is visiting the country. They're my guests on the programme today as we look at this question, whether the Catholic Church is a force for good or evil in the world. Well, I've been looking forward to this debate, gentlemen, because obviously it's a big thing with the Pope arriving in the UK in the coming week. And obviously you've both got different, presumably, views on his arrival. It might be interesting to start off with that a little bit in this programme before we get into the meat of this question of, is the Catholic Church a force for good or evil in the world? But let's meet our guest today, first of all. Peter D. Williams. We've had to make clear which Peter Williams you are, because there are two other Peter Williams who have contributed in the past to this programme. I don't know
far
whether
less unique, yeah.
Christian apologists must, sort of have a preference for their names. But anyway, Peter, thank you for joining us. A little bit about yourself. I read on this Catholic Voices website that you're part of the team of that, that you're a atheist revert to the Catholic faith. What might that mean exactly?
Well, I was brought up Catholic. My mother's devout Catholic, my dad's sort of agnostic/atheist. And I suppose a lot of people during the whole second decade of their life, including the 20s, and then just sort of have a time of questioning, really, and sort of doubting. But I became an atheist for a brief period because I thought, well, if there's no God, really, then there's no ultimate consequences to anything I do. Brilliant, I can do what I like. And, I realise that that's a very selfish point of view. Not every atheist would think that way. But that was the reason that I had for being an atheist. And it was essentially moral nihilism. But I wasn't able to completely follow it, because I eventually realised that, well, look, if you're going to believe that, if you want to say that there's no such thing as absolute morality, then really there's nothing intrinsically wrong with anything. Rape, torture, genocide, the Holocaust, child abuse, whatever's your big evil, it's not intrinsically wrong. It's wrong because you think it is. It's wrong because society tells you it is, or the culture or the state or whatever magisterium you happen to subscribe to. But there's nothing intrinsically wrong or transcendentally wrong about it. And I couldn't accept that. And that sort of to put the nail in the coffin of my atheism.
The moral argument for God, then, really was
that
sort
was
of where it came
persuasive
from.
to me. That's not the only argument that's persuasive, but that's what started me off.
We will actually be doing that in some detail in a couple of weeks' time with two philosophers, but anyway, that's a separate issue. Now, of course, you've, as it were, committed your life to Christianity, to the Catholic faith in particular. What did you make of this debate that took place about a year ago? There was this Intelligence Squared debate, debating this very question, is the Catholic Church a force for good? The panellists were Anne Widdecombe, of course, well-known MP, and has a Catholic faith of her own, Archbishop Oni Aiken, who's an African Archbishop of the Catholic Church, and they were against Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Fry. Many people say though it was very unevenly matched. The Catholics weren't represented well. People, what did you make of it?
I think calling it a debate is quite generous, actually. I enjoy debates. I've watched a lot of debates. And I think a real debate includes, the first propositions, or proposition and then negation, then rebuttal, then cross-examination period, which is very fruitful, then another rebuttal, and then the ending statements. And then I think then you can have, if you want, audience questions. In this case, what you had were 4 statements, no rebuttal. The small amount of rebuttal there was during the question and answer period from the floor, from the audience questions. And then they had the voting whilst the ending statements were going on. And this was a ridiculous way to go about a debate. It doesn't actually enlighten anyone. It was much more heat than light, in fact. And in fact, I think Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Fry really showed that what they didn't know about the Catholic Church rather outweighed what they did know about it. And so many of their criticisms were at straw men. It's very generous to call it a debate at all.
I mean, in a way, that is the way that these intelligence squared debate, if you call them that, happen. They have a looser kind of framework than, if you like, the very sort of tied down type of debate format. But I appreciate that does have problems in terms of people being able to formally reply to something. Nonetheless, I think the main problem that a lot of people seem to have with it was the quality of the candidates who were fielded. I mean, for you, is that an issue?
I think that, there's an interesting article by Christopher Lamb in the Tablet last November about this, that of the reasons why they chose the people they chose. And in fact, Archbishop John Onaiyekin was chosen precisely because someone bumped into him in an elevator. It wasn't really very well planned, this debate. Actually, Christopher Hitchens was saying you should really have someone like Dinesh D'Souza, who's a very sort of high-level Catholic apologist in America. So I think it could have been better organised and better structured. But yeah, my only quarrel, I suppose, my only problem with the Archbishop would have really been his presentation. I think he was stunningly under-ambitious when he was talking about why the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world. It seemed to be he was saying it's because we do a lot of charity work, and we do a lot of charity work. That's a very important part of the evangelization of the world, is actually to bring the kingdom of God, and that means social justice. But it's far beyond that why we believe that we are not only a force for good in the world, but the greatest force for good in the world.
Well,
so
we'll hear some of the excerpts that I've brought along with me for this programme of that debate. Not that is, if you like, not that we're simply reviewing that debate. We're having a debate of our own, but it might at least stimulate some of our thoughts and reflections as well. Andrew, thank you for joining us again on the programme. This must be the third or fourth time that you've come on the programme, so thank you very much for being with me. Andrew, you are the director of the British Humanist Association. Perhaps more pertinently in this case, though, part of this Protest the Pope coalition. Tell me, why are the British Humanist Association protesting the Pope's visit to the UK?
Well, although we think that as a religious leader and a European citizen, German citizen, he has every right to come to this country and to tour it, we don't think that he should be accorded the honour and recognition of a state visit. We consider the statehood of the Vatican, of the Holy See, in any case, more of a convenient fiction to amplify the Vatican's voice on the international stage. But either way, we think that a state visit which is publicly funded should not be accorded to the head of a state that does such harm on the international stage. And we protested about the King of Saudi Arabia, for example, coming on a state visit here when he came too, with a protest outside the Saudi embassy on that occasion. So this isn't a particularly new thing. It's made particularly more relevant, I suppose, because of the fact that he is the head of a state that, by any reckoning, isn't a real state anyway. And the Holy See's activities in relation to frustrating sexual health and reproductive rights on the international level, frustrating human rights for gay people and so on, are the sort of things that we object to.
We'll be talking about those things, I imagine, in the programme today. Yeah. But, before we get into that, it might be just interesting to get a response from you, Peter, there. And you obviously wholeheartedly support the visit. Sure. And what do you make of the Protest the Pope's reasons for why they feel that this shouldn't have been a state-funded, at very least, visit?
Well, to begin with, I think the problem is that the Vatican City is different from the Holy See. There are two different entities here. Vatican City was, in fact, generated in 1929 as an entity. It's a square mile of real estate really owned by the Holy See. And the Holy See is is essentially what the Pope is the head of. And that's actually the oldest international organisation on the planet. It's a state, whether Andrew likes it or not, and has been recognised by 200 countries, as it is today, and has observer status on the UN. So this is a state whether we like it or not, and it represents not just... It is a unique institution, actually. I mean, it's not simply representing the few people who live in Vatican City, that square mile I just referred to, but rather the billions of Catholics who live on the planet. So this is a unique institution. It's not irrelevant. It's not something that is the same as, say, the Dalai Lama. Or
didn't say it was irrelevant.
I didn't say it was. You did say it was irrelevant. Some people, I think, do think it's irrelevant because they feel
it's a very great relevance.
But
unfortunately,
but yeah, it is a state whether they like it or not. And the second, of course, objection that Andrew has, we're going to be going into in terms of what they have is a problem with the Church's doctrines, teachings, and practices.
That's not true.
And well, the teaching on homosexuality.
No, what we have a problem with is that doctrine being promulgated on an international level as if by a state. And I've personally seen the Holy See acting in the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe or the United Nations, and the way that it behaves as a state to amplify purely doctrinal religious beliefs as a state is what we object to.
So
we don't object, obviously, to a large religion having doctrine and promulgating those things. That's what religions do. I object to them using their status as a state to advance those things.
Well, as I say, the Catholic Church is a unique institution, and the Holy See is a unique institution. And what you're essentially saying is you object to the Holy See putting forward its values and its beliefs on the international stage.
As a state,
well,
yes.
The British government does that. The American government.
Britain is a state, and America is a state.
The Holy See is a state.
It is
like
not
it
a
or not.
state.
It is a state. Whether you like it or not.
Well,
it's recognised by 200 governments.
To say that lots of people think that something is the case is not the same to say it is the case. You say that 200 states recognise the Holy See as a state. Well, maybe, but that doesn't mean that it should be a state, or that it is a state, or that treating it as a state is right. That's no evidence for that position.
Well, obviously, we're not. I'm not here to. In this way, we could spend the whole programme debating the rights and wrongs of the Pope's visit being treated as a state visit, but we're not here to do that, and lots of other people are doing that, and there are many places you can find online other debates going on in that regard. But today, we want to look at the bigger question that, if you like, goes on whether the Pope is visiting our country or not. Is the Catholic Church a force for good or evil in the world? Of course, our headlines have been full in the last few years of lots of lurid headlines about Catholic priests, abuse, child abuse, obviously the whole issue about the approach of the Catholic Church to AIDS and HIV and condoms in Africa is a recurrent one. And many other things besides. We'll, as I say, be hearing a few inserts during the programme from what Christopher Hitchens, Stephen Fry, Anne Widdecombe and Archbishop Onyeakin had to say on the matter at that Intelligence Squared debate of last year. And we welcome your input as well. If you'd like to drop me an email in response to today's programme, you're more than welcome to do that at unbelievable@premier.org.uk. Again, that's unbelievable@premier.org.uk.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Perhaps we'll start off then with hearing from some of these speakers that we had. This first clip comes from Archbishop Onyeakin, who is a Catholic archbishop, and we'll hear him explaining now why he believes that one of the major factors for the belief that the Catholic Church is a force for good is simply the vast amount of humanitarian work that goes on across the globe.
Independent statistics have shown that the Catholic Church is doing far more than its numbers and its population would probably suggest. The action of the Church is most significant in communities that are reduced to poverty and misery by human neglect and sometimes by hostile environments. Talking of statistics, I spoke recently with the Director General of UNAIDS, which is the United Nations Agency for HIV and AIDS, and he said that 26% of the health institutions in the world directly involved with the treatment of HIV and AIDS are run by the Catholic Church. And please note that whenever we are engaged in social welfare work, it is always given to all without any discrimination, whether you believe or not.
Just a small segment there from the opening speech of Archbishop Onyekun. Surely it can't be denied, Andrew, that the Catholic Church does an awful lot of good in the world.
I think that's absolutely true. Of course, that's true. Humanitarian work, when it's done by anyone, Catholic or Protestant or Muslim or humanist, has to be welcomed as humanitarian work. There's no question about that.
And is this simply then a case of saying, well, does the good outweigh the bad? Is this how we sort of approach this question, or whether the Church is overall a force for good?
Well, I think if I can say that, the first thing is that to make a case for whether or not something is good or bad is really impossible on balance. You can say that something does a lot of harm, something does a lot of good, but I don't think we can possibly weigh in the balance, 1,500 or more years of wicked and benevolent actions. One thing I would say about humanitarian work is that I think that the Catholic Church is obviously an organisation with international reach, and there are many organisations with international reach. I would say that it was incidental to the fact of it being an international organisation with such wide reach that it does such humanitarian work, and not essential. I mean, I think you don't have to be a Catholic and you don't have to be the Catholic Church to do humanitarian work. People of goodwill everywhere always will do humanitarian work. And so insofar as the Catholic Church happens to be, because of history, an organising principle around which humanitarian work is possible, I think it's not the same thing as to say that therefore the Catholic Church does humanitarian work because the Catholic Church itself is a good thing.
I mean, are you suggesting essentially because the Catholic Church, there are so many people in the world who are Catholic, it's inevitable that a certain amount of the humanitarian work going on in the world will be because of Catholics doing
That's
it?
That's more or less what I'm saying,
And
yes.
It would be happening whether or not they called themselves Catholics?
Yes, I think that if we'd had, any religion that had emerged in, the Middle East and Europe 2,000 years ago and then spread around the world, it would inevitably be doing benevolent works. I would say that I think what the Archbishop is saying about them opening services up to everyone, humanitarian and welfare services up to everyone, is not always true all over the world. Some places there is discrimination in some services that are provided. And I personally prefer to see humanitarian services that don't rely on any one particular religion or worldview, and I'd include humanism in that. I would never want there are international development agencies in Scandinavia, for example, that are explicitly humanist, but they don't go around talking about humanism, and they don't sort of preach humanism at the same time as they're doing the humanitarian work. And I think sometimes religious organisations, by which I include the Catholic Church, do, and I think that humanitarian work is better if it's done for its own sake than if it's done either to satisfy the will of God or to spread a certain religious message.
So you don't like the idea that religious propagation goes hand in hand with this kind of humanitarian work?
No, I don't, but I don't say that it always happens, but when it does, I don't like it, no.
Peter, what's your response?
Well, I think the more interesting question here, I appreciate everything Andrew's just said, but I think the more interesting question here is really on what basis we call anything good or evil. Because the whole premise of the debate, is the Catholic Church a force for good or evil in the world, is that we know what good and evil is. And I don't admit, or I don't accept, that a humanist worldview has the bases for saying what is good and evil. That doesn't mean to say that I don't think that humanists do good things, or that Andrew is a good person, or that they do things that I recognise as morally good, but that humanist worldview cannot give us, on a metaphysical level, the reason for saying, well, this is good, that is evil, beyond a very subjective and relative perspective on that whole debate. So, the Catholic Church does do a lot of good in the world. It's actually, I've got here the Heart Speaks to Heart Visit of the Pope Benedict XVI booklet, and it talks about the many good things the Catholic Church does. More than 50% of all the healthcare provided in Africa is done by faith-based organisations, and the Catholic Church is a very large part of that. It runs 5,246 hospitals, 17,530 dispensaries, 577 leprosy clinics. It provides a quarter of all HIV/AIDS care in all of Africa, and we could go on. We accept that grounding, but what we disagree on, I think, or what we have a difference with, is that I think that the metaphysic that I adopt has a meaningful account of what is good and evil, whereas I don't accept that what Andrew has can give us a meaningful account of what good or evil is, or whether good and evil even exist.
I think I probably believe the opposite. I probably think that Catholic belief is what actually frustrates the idea of having any meaningful sense of good on a human scale, in a human sense. When, of course, it's always true that any word that we use means what we intend to convey by it. If you remember the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland, when I use a word, it means precisely what I intend it to mean. And that's true of all human words, which after all are just concepts, which are just sort of sounds that we we have used to denote certain concepts. When it comes to good, all humanists and many people, even some religious people who don't base their concept of what is good in their religion, when it comes to good, I would say that something that is good, that I would call good, would be something that advances human fulfillment, human flourishing, human welfare. That would be, as far as I'm concerned, a provisional definition of what is good. And what is bad is what harms people, what causes them to not flourish, what causes them to lack fulfillment, what causes them unhappiness and a diminution in their well-being. They would be my provisional definitions of what is good and what is bad.
But Andrew, if man is the measure, if all we really have as a source of morality is humanity, human beings, human institutions, there is no transcendent moral lawgiver, God, whatever you want to call it.
That's right, yes.
If there isn't that,
Yes.
then all morality really just comes from human beings with their own perspectives, with their own biases, from their own experiences and cultures. And really, therefore, whatever one person calls morality can be fundamentally different to another. I mean, what
that's
transcendentally, universally, can be a source of morality for all human beings, regardless of their background or culture? I mean, what makes you right and the Nazis wrong?
I think the mistake there is the assumption that you need something transcendental in order to have universality. And the humanist philosopher Karl Popper in the mid-20th century used a good analogy in response to that claim. And he said that morality is like food. Breakfast and lunch and dinner and supper, if you have it, and all those sorts of meal times are human inventions. They are not the reflection of some transcendent mealtime law written into the universe, right? They're human customs and inventions. But the need to take in food and the need to space out the taking in of food over time is a natural necessity, a compunction. And we can see by our analysis, especially in modern anthropology and social biology of especially the higher primates, that the social instincts written into the biology of human beings, as they are to many other creatures, provide a powerful foundation on which we can assume that morality, and since we've been conscious animals, we've given it a name, morality, and we've developed concepts on the back of it, in which it can flourish. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that is the reality of the situation that's evidenced by the natural world, and we just have to deal with it. Now, I'm not saying that if you did have a transcendent law, that might not be better, although I worry about the freedom to choose that it seems to negate in human life, which I think is a very important part of morality. But I'm just saying that there isn't such a transcendent reality. And I think that even you had to choose to follow this. Well, it wasn't entirely a choice because, as you say, you were raised a Catholic, and so it wasn't entirely a free choice.
Well, in that case, no one has a free choice, and so everyone is informed by their background.
Well, that's partly true, of course. I mean, the thing about free will is to accept that it's probably not in existence, but to behave as if it is. I mean, we're all formed by a lot of experiences. Yes.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say we do have free will. Free will is purely the ability to choose between different propositions. It's not having a completely objective and perfect view of all the choices one could have.
Well, that's another definition. And I would agree that if by that definition also we do have.
I mean, obviously we could go into a discourse on whether morality exists in an objective sense or not, or whether it's all conditioned by society, and that is just what we have to live with. But in a sense, whether you do or don't believe in an objective standard of morality, I suppose what the people are saying here in this argument is that, well, the Catholic Church is doing well or isn't doing well, to whichever, wherever that morality comes from.
And who decides.
I mean,
it's all fundamentally problematic because you haven't dealt with the fundamental presuppositions.
What's wrong with my definition about benefiting human welfare and flourishing and fulfillment or not? I mean, what you could easily
for one thing,
say.
How do we define human flourishing? And for another thing, who do we flourish? I mean, what if there's a conflict between people's welfare? I mean, for example, one could quite easily argue that a certain proportion of the population would benefit from the slavery of others. One could very easily argue that, in fact, if we had the ability to save millions of people through horrific experimentation on human beings, then that might very well be justified, since, after all, it would lead to the human flourishing of many more people than the people who are being experimented on. I mean, in these kind of situations...
Well, I think to bring number and calculation of number into a moral question is quite appalling in that
well,
way.
the utilitarians like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham
not
did
like
do,
John
and-
Stuart Mill, certainly didn't. John Stuart Mill
Well, he was
did
ruled
not do that.
utilitarianism, yes, but-
Yeah. I mean, the idea, nonetheless, what you've presented is a caricature of that position anyway, because one of the starting points of saying that, even a utilitarian approach to morality, is that every individual has a value in that calculation.
But
and
why
so
do you
you
believe
can
that?
never... What do you mean, why?
Why do you believe any human being has value? I mean,
Why do I believe it, or why should
does
other
anyone
people
believe it
it?
has value? I mean, where do you get value from? Where is this word? Where is this concept?
Because we have the capacity to empathise, we have the capacity to see ourselves in other people, some not always, and sometimes it's diminished by, for example, religious dogmas that negatively integrate against other people. But we do, as human beings, have the capacity to see our face in the faces of others, and we have the human norm is to have a certain empathy with other people, and that's building on quite a solid foundation, really, if we take that natural empathy as our base. So I think
so
that
you're
there's
relying
every
on a feeling,
reason...
really. Your morality is essentially based on, well, because I feel this other person here, therefore, I recognise that the humanity of another person, therefore they have value. I think
that's right. I think our feelings and our emotions do have a lot to do with our moral sense. After all, I mean, I don't see how we can know, for example, how we could treat others well if we didn't have some sense of what makes ourselves feel happy. I mean, it's a great... one interpretation of Western civilization is to say that really ideas of human rights and of benevolence and international justice really take off when a certain number of people are quite materially comfortable themselves. So it's only when you start to get a commercial world where people seek comfort for themselves they can really start to think about how others don't have comfort. So I think that certainly emotions and feelings are an important foundation for our moral sense. They give us the capacity to empathise with other people.
But if someone
I think
disagreed
it's
with
sound.
that, what would you say to them? I mean, if someone says, well, actually, I don't think that's at all relevant. Actually, I define value by someone's race or their sexuality or whatever. I mean, there's no real overarching thing that you can appeal to that's to say, well, actually, no, you're wrong. There's no ultimate value system that transcends your perspective, their perspective, and any other
Nor is
perspective.
there for you, because lots of people won't believe in your system.
Absolutely,
so, I mean, you
except
can
that
never...
my system is based in truth and theirs is not. And I can argue the case with them on that point. Whereas you can't. You can't say, well, my system is transcendentally completely right and yours is not.
I think I'd like to move us on because
that's a totalitarian approach, though. To say, well, the reason that I can argue it is because I am right and the other person is not. Is something that
That's pretty much what we do with
down
Nazis and any other kind of totalitarian. Actually, we argue they're wrong.
I mean, for an even more a longer discussion on this, as I say, do tune in again in a couple of weeks' time. We're going to be having a discussion on the very existence of moral values. But for the moment, it might be interesting to focus in the next section of the programme on some of the more practical aspects, whether because there are people who do believe in moral absolutes who still think that the Catholic Church isn't living up to those moral absolutes, or whatever it may be. So let's move on, and in just a couple of minutes' time, join me again as we continue this discussion on whether the Catholic Church is a force for good or evil in the world. With my guest today, Andrew Copson, Director of the British Humanist Association and part of the Protest the Pope organisation, and Peter D. Williams, former atheist, now a Catholic and a theology student, and many more things besides. We'll continue this discussion in just a moment's time.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to Unbelievable, the programme on Saturday afternoons on Premier Christian Radio, bringing Christians and non-Christians together. Today looking at the question, is the Catholic Church a force for good or bad in the world? My guests on the programme today are Andrew Copson, Director of the British Humanist Association. He's part of the Protest the Pope group, and he's been telling us why he doesn't believe, and he'll continue to tell us why he doesn't believe that the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world. We'll also continue to hear from Peter D. Williams. He's a young Catholic, he's a theologian, and he's continuing to lay out the case for why he believes there's more than enough evidence to show that the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world today. I'll be giving you the details to get in touch if you want to express your views in regard to this as well during the course of the programme. Well, as we come back into this discussion, let's again start out with a clip from that Intelligence Squared debate last year. One of the main protagonists against the Catholic Church was Christopher Hitchens. Here's what he had to say about the Catholic record in Africa.
That there will be an apology for what happened in Rwanda. the most Catholic country in Africa, where priests and nuns and bishops are on trial for inciting from their pulpits and on the church's radio stations and newspapers the massacre of their brothers and sisters. Staying in Africa, I think it will one day be admitted with shame that it might have been in error to say that AIDS is bad as a disease, very bad, but not quite as bad as condoms are bad, or not as immoral in the same way. I say it in the presence of His grace, and I say it to His face. The preachings of His church are responsible for the death and suffering and misery of millions of His brother and sister Africans, and He should apologize for it. He should show some shame.
Impassioned stuff from that debate. Peter, what would be your response to this? Because whether or not we can agree or not on whether there is an overarching transcendent morality, many people will say, well, if Catholics believe there is, they certainly haven't lived up to it. Look at the example in Rwanda of Catholic priests involved in genocide. And of course there is this constant issue about the Catholic Church's view of contraception and how that plays out in Africa. What are your responses to those kinds of issues?
Well, yeah, I mean, the argument is essentially that the Catholic Church supposedly exacerbates the situation of HIV/AIDS in Africa because by denying people the use of condoms, in other words, by saying to Catholics who are in Africa, you may not use condoms, morally it's wrong. Essentially that means that they go out, they contract AIDS and then they spread it to other people because they're not using condoms. I find this problematic on two levels. Firstly, it's fundamentally irrational, and the second thing is it's fundamentally evidentially bereft. It's irrational because it's essentially saying, well, the reason why you contract AIDS, generally speaking, if you contract HIV, rather, is by promiscuity, prostitution, other forms of dodgy sexual acts, by drug abuse sometimes, by faulty blood transfusions. Now, the faulty blood transfusions have nothing to do with the condom. The other four are moral actions that you engage in. Now, the Catholic Church preaches against prostitution, adultery, many forms of dodgy sexual acts and drug abuse. So to say, well, the Catholic Church is preaching against condoms, so you've got all these Catholics out there who are essentially engaging in promiscuity, who are essentially engaging in dangerous sexual behaviour. But when it comes to condoms, say, oh, excuse me, sorry, I have my principles. I won't use the condom. I find that fundamentally irrational. I find that silly as an objection. But even if that weren't the case, I think it's evidentially bereft. When the Pope last year, well, not last year, I think it was possibly the year before, well, perhaps it was last year anyway, when he said that simply proliferating condoms throughout Africa actually makes the situation worse. It doesn't just not solve the problem, it makes it worse. He was supported actually by leading experts like Dr. Stephen Seagreen, who is a medical anthropologist of more than 30 years' experience, who headed up the AIDS Prevention Center in Harvard University, who pointed out that when you proliferate condoms in Africa, what tends to happen is that people engage in what's known as risk compensatory behaviour. So they have this risk reduction technology like a condom. They sleep with someone who has they engage in sex, and they engage actually in more promiscuous sex precisely because they feel, well, I'm safe. I'm using this condom. And what that actually does statistically, it actually increases their chances of having AIDS. So actually, the irony is that on the point of large-scale populations, the actual proliferation of condoms doesn't actually reduce the spread of AIDS. On individual sex acts, it does. I wouldn't want to say that if you use a condom and you're having an individual act of sex, that you don't have a vastly reduced chance of contracting HIV and AIDS. It depends on whether or not you use it properly. It's 98% effective only if you use it properly. The typical use rate of condoms is far less. But nonetheless, this is what happens. This is what the experts say. I mean, I would go to also people like Dr. René Kochald, who's a director of biostatistics at the University of Lyon Hospital, who has also said, if you want to look at the one country in the entirety of Africa who has actually reduced their HIV prevalence rates, it's been Uganda, who used the ABC procedure, which is to say, abstinence, be faithful to one another, and use condoms as a last resort. And if you want to say, well, it was the condoms bit that worked there, well, you really have to tell us why every other country in Africa which has used a purely condoms-based strategy has actually failed to reduce its HIV prevalence rates. The way that Dr. Green, Dr. René Kochard and others have said, you really want to reduce HIV/AIDS in Africa, is to do exactly what the Church is saying, which is to say, be faithful to one another. In other words, engage in monogamy and be chaste within your monogamous relationships. The reduction of partners and the faithfulness within those partner relationships is exactly what turns away HIV/AIDS, and not condoms.
I'm sure you'll want to respond there, Andrew.
Well, There were 2 points, I think, in what Christopher Hitchin was saying. One was about the Catholic Church's frequent involvement and complicity in very damaging regimes across the world, whether that's from Nazi Germany to the regime of General Pinochet to Franco to what happened in Rwanda. I'm sure that's a discussion that we can have. The second, on the use of condoms, there are Catholic archbishops in Africa who have held bonfires of condoms. There are Catholic archbishops in Africa who have said that condom usage causes the spread of AIDS. These actions plainly contribute instead to the spread of AIDS. It's fine to say, oh, this one person in America or this one person in France said that actually this strategy didn't work as well, and so what the Pope said was therefore true. But the World Health Organization condemned him, and the Lancet in this country called on him to retract his statement. In fact, his statement was modified on the Vatican website afterwards, thankfully, to reflect that, the Pope's statement to reflect that. We could, of course, all skip around living in a complete la-la land where everyone would live in accordance to the narrow and strict doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church on when they should and shouldn't have sex, but we don't live in that world. We never will live in that world, and we have to deal, when we're formulating public policy, with the world that we do live in. And to say, well, because we don't think that people should have sex outside of marriage or be promiscuous, and therefore we won't support a strategy that will prevent the spread of sexually transmitted infections, is bizarre. It's bizarre because it doesn't correspond to reality, and it's bizarre on its own terms because it leaves completely untouched, for example, the idea of a perfectly virginal woman who marries a man who is promiscuous and then contracts AIDS that way, who wouldn't have if a condom hadn't been used. On this Catholic narrative that we've just heard, she herself is completely blameless, and yet the Vatican policy, the policy of the Pope, the policy of the Roman Catholic Church, would apparently be perfectly comfortable with her being infected.
And in that situation, what makes you think she has any power to force her husband to actually use a condom in the first place? What makes you think he'd even be honest?
That's got nothing to do with the argument. You're going on to a completely different argument. Which is
I think it's fundamental to the argument. If you want to say that using a condom, and apart from the fact you haven't dealt with the actual point that, in fact, condoms-only policies have not worked in Africa, which completely contradicts all the
condom usage is extremely high in Uganda. You can't whip Uganda out and say that somehow it's a chaste country.
Really, it's very high.
All.
Do you have the figure for that?
Well, I understand from the World Health Organization report that it is. But I mean,
the World Health Organization argues for this based on ideology and not on facts. It's not actually proved in any country on the planet that this has worked. And if you compare, actually, for example, Thailand and Thailand and the Philippines? Thailand has used a condoms-only policy to actually reduce.
I don't believe you see that is really why either you are saying that condoms shouldn't be used, or why the Pope is saying that condoms shouldn't be used. That's not really why, is it?
Thing, but we are discussing here.
No, because the broad case
actually reduce or do not reduce those risk of the spread of HIV AIDS in Africa. That's the fundamental question in this discussion.
And they do.
Well, they don't.
Yes, they do.
No, they don't. That would give me one example. One example of one country where it's reduced HIVs in Africa.
That is a completely ridiculous question to ask, because you cannot isolate strategies in that way. And you
can by national governments.
I mean, but I get the sense that what Andrew is fundamentally asking is, look, you're not actually ultimately interested in, the reason you're banning condoms is not because you think we're better off without condoms for this health reason. It's because there's a theological reason behind the banning of contraception wholesale.
Yes,
and is it wrong to somehow impose upon large segments of population this belief when there may be better ways in which people can live their lives if they didn't have those kinds of beliefs imposed on them?
If people live their lives according to the teachings of the Catholic Church, and by the way, that is possible, and many, many people do it. It's not to live in La La Land to do it. I do it, and many other people do.
All people will never do it, though.
And to say
the idea that
all
people
it's irrelevant. We're talking about
Catholics.
That was
your argument.
The Catholic Church only directs its teachings towards Catholics. The Catholics in Africa are the ones who are being, it is claimed, are being affected by this policy.
The Catholic Church lobbies governments in order to promote these policies as well. The Catholic Church in the Philippines explicitly has said, for example, that it lobbies the Philippines,
which is a Catholic country.
Well, not everyone in the Philippines is a Catholic, though. Not everyone in a Catholic... I mean, that's theocracy, to say, well, everyone should live under...
Theocracy is when the priesthood runs the state. It's not when the state is actually run along Catholic lines, actually. But nonetheless...
Well, I disagree. My definition of theocracy would be it would be when a state...
but nonetheless, in places like... in a place like Africa, in places like Thailand, places like the Philippines, when you actually... What the Catholic Church preaches is a gospel of life. And if actually governments and peoples actually lived their lives according to the teachings of the Catholic Church, we wouldn't have. If actually people did not decide to have promiscuous sex, if they didn't decide to engage in drug abuse, if they didn't decide to sleep around with many people, then you wouldn't have the spread of HIV/AIDS in Africa. And so the consistency of the Church's position is this: if you live a chaste life, you don't need to live to use condoms. And if you, well, I mean, the situation you've had, in the situation you've had before, well, I'm afraid it's not, because people do live this way. But if you actually want to use the example you used of this woman who's married someone who's HIV positive or has AIDS, and she's going to be infected,
or is
well,
raped
in
by
that
someone.
case, or is raped, in which case a condom is completely irrelevant. So none
Yes,
of
but
this.
the point is that man might not have AIDS in the first place if these contraceptive policies have been
We,
rolled back
we,
insignificantly.
I'd like us to move on to another aspect of this, because that's a very current issue. What's also at stake is, let's look back. Has the Catholic Church been a force for good? And we'll do just that after I've given out our email address and the ways to get in contact again. If you want to email, that's unbelievable@premier.org.uk. Again, that's unbelievable@premier.org.uk. The podcast of this programme available now at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. That's premier.org.uk/unbelievable, or it soon will be if it's not quite there yet. So do check back there and email it on to friends if you'd like to find out more. Also links there, of course, to the Premier community. The Unbelievable forum there is where many people are discussing these kinds of topics. Again, that's premier.org.uk/unbelievable.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Something many people bring up, not just in regard to the Catholic Church, but Christianity in general, is a history of crusades and inquisitions and torture and everything else. Well, this was something that certainly wasn't lacking as well in the presentations of that Intelligence Squared debate. This is, of course, Stephen Fry now, talking about a history of torture, and this is what he had to say on the matter.
Just imagine in this square mile how many people were burned for reading the Bible in English. And one of the principal burners and torturers of those who tried to read the Bible in English here in London was Thomas More. Now, that's a long time ago. It's not relevant, except that it was only last century that Thomas More was made a saint, and it was only in the year 2000 that the last pope, the Pole, he made Thomas More the patron saint of politicians. This is a man who put people on the rack for daring to own a Bible in English. He tortured them for owning a Bible in their own language. The idea that the Catholic Church exists to disseminate the word of the Lord is nonsense. It is the only owner of the truth for the billions that it likes to boast about, because those billions are uneducated and poor, as again it likes to boast about.
There you go. Obviously, this is one that is brought up many a time in conversations I have with friends, not just in regard to the Catholics, but, how can Christianity claim to be a good religion when there's been this history of burnings and torture and everything else? Peter, what's your initial response to that?
Well, okay, I'll deal first with Mr. Fry. The two things that shocked me about that is the condescension and the profound ignorance of what he was saying. To say that the vast majority of Catholics are only Catholics because they're illiterate peasants essentially is so utterly condescending. And but even then, I mean, let's go to the substance of what he actually said. He essentially said that St. Thomas More, he was actually my favourite saint, actually, went to actually put people on the rack because they read the Bible in English. He gets two things wrong there. Firstly, he never put anyone on the rack. St. Thomas More, if the only source you have for that kind of information is if you read Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is hardly recognised historically as an independent and unbiased martyrology. Apart from that, and St. Thomas More, by the way, denied that he tortured anyone. This is a guy who went to his death rather than tell what he considered to be a lie. I hardly think it likely that he would be willing to make that little lie when he was going to go to his death for refusing to do the bigger lie of saying that the king is the head of the Church of England. Nonetheless, he also said that people were sent to the stake for reading the Bible in English. They weren't sent to the stake for reading the Bible in English. They were sent to the stake, and first off, we have to say that was utterly reprehensible and wrong, and of course we recognise that. You have to look at that in the context of its time. Obviously, people in those days saw heresy, which is to say false doctrine, as we see terrorism today. They saw it as something which was dangerous not only to the polity, to the state and to the country as a whole, it breaks down society, which it did do, but they also saw it as dangerous in the sense that it sent people to hell. So it was better to execute someone for doing that, for essentially sending people to hell, and make an example of them so that other people won't go to hell. Now that is tortured logic, terrible, and we would condemn it today. And of course, much worse things have been done by people like.
Is this just justification, though? I mean, Andrew, what's your response? Do you feel?
Well, it's not justification, no, but it's an attempt at justification.
That's essentially what I meant.
In a sense, what I'm saying is, you see people in their context, historical context. I'm not saying it was right.
Yes,
if I was saying it was right because of what they had,
it is important to see people in their historical context. That's always important, and I think that in its historical context, the Church as an authority was extreme in its treatment of people who dissented from it. In their historical context, they are an example of extreme wrong done. So even in its context, I think that's no full explanation for the what the Catholic
one
Church
of the things
Europe
that
did.
Stephen Fry did to Anne Widdecombe's rebuttal of, well, if you like, the Catholic Church at that time was a product of its time to some degree. Was saying.
Let's remember something. Sorry, can I just say it's not a product of its time. The Catholic Church made its own times. The Catholic Church was the first institution in Europe to begin to torture and to execute people for what they believed, rather than for what they did. So the Catholic Church made these times. It's not as if it was a poor, passive byproduct of his historical contingencies.
And indeed,
made this
what
case.
Stephen Fry was saying on the back of that was, well, even if you made that argument that the Church should have been showing, isn't that the whole point of the Church, the Catholic Church, that it leads the way, that it points people towards the correct morality? That's a tough one, isn't it, Peter?
I mean, certainly, I would never. I'm not a Catholic because I believe in Catholics. I'm a Catholic because I believe in Catholicism, and I believe in Christ. I believe in Christianity. So I don't. The fact that there have been terrible Catholics who have burned people, who have tortured people, who have done all these sorts of things, and the Catholic Church had very bad policies in the past. The Church has never claimed to be infallible on all the different elements of its policies. It claims to be infallible only in its teachings, in the teachings of the truth. And yes, the Church has sinned, and members of the Church have sinned in the past. That's not relevant to today, but on an historical level, and as I say, to slander St. Thomas More by saying he basically tortured people for reading the Bible in English, I think is reprehensible. The people who were the Bible in English, the objection was not the idea that the Bible was written in English. The Bible had already been written in English anyway, by Catholics. The whole idea was that it was written in English, translated by someone, and then with added notes which were heretical, which were going to lead people to hell. Because we had this confluence of power and religion, which shouldn't have happened. So in other words, there shouldn't have been Cardinal Wolsey, who was the Chancellor of England. There shouldn't have been this combination of church and state. Doesn't mean I think there should be a separation of church and state. That's a whole other issue. But the fact that the two were fundamentally entwined like that led to the church being abused and abusing the power that was given it. I think the fact that we now have today a situation where the Catholic Church does not believe that any member of its clerical body should be in any way a politician. This is why Cardinal Murphy O'Connor was not allowed to be a member of the House of Lords, although Gordon Brown would have liked him to have been. The fact that that's the case, I think, is very progressive. And, in fact, it was Catholic thinkers like St. Francis Suarez who are actually arguing against the idea of a state church, like the Anglican Church. So what was problematic at the time was the confluence of religion and power, state power. And the fact that we don't have that anymore is, I think, that what has led to the church being purified of the things that had been added to it that led it to, yes, in certain individual situations, torture people. But this has been exaggerated grossly by people for effect. The fact is that even the Spanish Inquisition, which is people's definition of the terrors of the Catholic Church,
which no one expects.
Which no one expects, exactly. What you always expect to come up in argument, actually killed, the number of people it actually executed was infinitesimally small. Actually, the number of the actual vast majority of people in Spain who were killed were done by the state, and actually a lot of people blasphemed deliberately in court because they knew that if they were tried by the Spanish Inquisition, which is what happened when you blasphemed in a secular court, then actually they would get off easy with some penance, because the Spanish Inquisition largely did not kill people, did not torture people. It did it on occasion, and that was utterly reprehensible. But the historical record has been totally exaggerated, firstly by Protestant fundamentalist apologists, and now by atheist apologists for the effect of actually a bit attacking the church.
I mean, do you feel like this is a kind of potent point today, Andrew? I mean, you might
Which
feel...
one?
Well, I'm just thinking, though, that many people might think, well, OK, that was then. it's the evils of today that we need to focus on.
Well,
and the Catholic abuse of children, etc., is something that kind of comes about a great deal.
That comes up a lot. That's true. I mean, I think that the great crimes of the past that the Catholic Church has perpetrated and encouraged are interesting if you're arguing this general proposition about whether it has been a good or a bad influence in human history, and I think that they speak to the bad very strongly. I think it is difficult to think of another institution in its position that would have caused such harm and tortured and executed so many people. But you're right, the harms of today are more pertinent, and one of those, as you say, that's been extremely, because it's extremely emotional issue, has been the abuse of children and the protection of people who have abused children and the frustration of international justice in the case of those who have abused children. And I mean, some of the really extreme examples, like the priest in Boston who molested 200 deaf children over time. I mean, these things pile up and they pile up and they pile up, and they do take you closer to a conclusion that the Catholic Church as an institution, that the Holy See as a state in inverted commas, and that the church hierarchy generally is extremely culpable for a very large amount of unendurable human misery, and has not tried to put it right. I said that contributes to that view. That's a view I also share, by the way, and it's a very well evidenced view.
I mean, to say that the Catholic hierarchy is, and a great deal of them are culpable for misery is a complete nonsense. Certainly in the sex abuse scandal. Well, it depends on what misery you're talking about, of course, in terms of what my answer would be. But I don't think that the church hierarchy.
I mean, let's talk about this child abuse just in the last few minutes that we have here, guys.
I'll just point out, though, just to end off the previous discussion, we've just moved very quickly through that, in that the actual states that have committed the worst crimes have been the atheist ones in history, and at least the Catholic states, the Catholic states actually, and the Christian states that have caused all these that have engaged in terrible acts, at least have a limiting factor, and the limiting factor is they believe in a gospel, or at least sensibly in a gospel of love that actually says that human beings have intrinsic value because they are made in the image of God, whereas atheist states have no basis for that human value at all, and for that reason have murdered millions upon millions of people, which makes the Spanish Inquisition look like a picnic, a teddy bear's party in comparison.
That is the sort of extreme, unevidenced, bizarre, illogical statement that it comes up again and again from that side of the argument all the time. The reason that states that were officially non-religious behaved in this way is not because they didn't believe in God, but because they had totalitarian and dogmatic philosophies of their own, exactly the same as the Catholic Church has behaved in the past.
Militant
but the proper analogy for that is the Catholic Church, not humanism or atheists today or atheism as a worldview.
Quite the contrary. At least the Catholic Church was leading the way in condemning slavery and condemning the mistreatment of women under Roman culture back in the 300s.
Church engaged
at least the Catholic Church has been leading the way in all sorts of moral reforms, whereas atheism
leads us
with absolutely no basis for any kind of moral reform at all.
These statements are foolish. I mean, that's a totally, you can't just make a statement like that. The Catholic Church has not led many moral reform movements, many social reform movements. That's just not true. And it's not true that atheists haven't led any. The first three heads of the UN humanitarian institutions in the 1950s were all British humanists.
That's
right.
So
what you just said isn't true then, is it?
No,
atheists
it is,
have led
there's the simplest question of, can atheists be moral? Of course they can be moral, according to what I think is moral at least, or at least what Christianity thinks is moral. But can they actually justify that in any way? I don't want to go back to our original discussion.
But you know what? You keep saying they can't justify it in any way. But I try to justify it. I think there are many people who have... No, but if you never ever will accept anything, if you seem to me very close-minded and very illogical on these questions. If you say, well, it just can never be justified, then I'm afraid you'll never accept justification.
We're going to have to draw things...
That is a totally self-defeating proposition and typical of the dogmatism.
I would like to...
Well, we've got a chance to just
go to the child abuse.
All right, well, we will, and we'll do that in a very quick summation in the next section of the programme. So do stay tuned as we conclude this discussion on is the Catholic Church a force for good or evil in the world? Welcome back to Unbelievable, the final part of the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together on a regular basis. Not so much in the format of Christian, non-Christian next week, though, but continuing the Catholic theme, we'll be sort of towards the end of that visit of Pope Benedict XVI. And so we're going to be looking at a theological issue between Protestants and Catholics next week. William Johnstone is a Catholic priest, was actually in the Anglican Church, but went over to Rome, as they say, and he's going to be in conversation with Duncan Boyd of the Protestant Truth Society. They're going to be looking at papal authority. The idea that the Pope is essentially the right-hand man of God on earth, as it were. And so we'll be looking at that claim, and we'll be hearing their discussion at the same time next week between 2:30 and 4 o'clock here on Premier Christian Radio and online at premier.org.uk/unbelievable.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Back to the programme in hand, however, and we've been looking at the question, is the Catholic Church a force for good or evil in the world? My guests are Andrew Copson of the British Humanist Association, part of the Protest the Pope coalition. He's been arguing that it is not a force for good. Also with me, Peter D. Williams, young Catholic apologist and theologian, part of the Catholic Voices group, who are aiming to provide, if you like, a media-friendly pro-Catholic voice during the visit of Pope Benedict XVI. And let's get back into the conversation with them. Okay, so coming back to this discussion, guys, we've had a lot of toing and froing on various aspects of whether the Catholic Church is good or evil in various regards. The big one that I think we haven't addressed properly yet, and we're just going to have to do this in a few minutes, so really it's just going to be a couple of statements from you guys. The whole thing about the abuse of children under Catholic priests in Catholic institutions. This is a stain that surely the Catholic Church is going to find it very, very hard to rid itself of, isn't it, Peter?
Certainly, I think that, the first thing to say about that is anyone who is listening to this programme or has been abused, the Church has, and I personally as a Catholic do express my utter shame that this has happened by Catholic priests or by anyone who is Catholic. What matters, though, I think more is not just the words we say in apology to this, which the Church has gone through, but also the things that we've done to actually stop this and to repair the damage that's been done. And when you look at this Pope, and when you look at what the Church has done over the last decade and more about this question, whether it be reforming seminary procedures so that we make sure that the people going into seminary are psychologically tested to the nth degree. When you talk about the child protection policies in this country, for example, through the Nolan Report, which is, the Catholic Church in this country is the only organisation which publishes reports of sexual abuse claims that have been made against members of its clergy. If you look at all the things that the Church has done, and especially under this Pope, who was a leading reformer in changing the Church from the inside, in making sure that the kind of cover-ups could not happen, that candle law was revised, and the procedures were revised, so that the police, in the appropriate circumstances, were told when sexual abuse has been accused of a priest, so that laicization has been quickened up. Laicization, is the turning of priests from priests into lay people, essentially. When you look at all the reforms the Church has done, it is really, really made a strong effort to clean up the act, essentially.
But that's the least it could do, surely. Andrew. Yeah. What about the fact that there were cover-ups? Is this for you the problem here?
Well, that's right. When the Irish Department of Justice and Equality and Law Reform published its report on the abuse cases that had occurred in the Archdiocese of Dublin, they said that, well, I'll quote it actually, the Dublin Archdiocese's preoccupations in dealing with cases of child sex abuse were the maintenance of secrecy, the avoidance of scandal, the protection of the reputation of the Church, and the preservation of its assets. And that's something that recurs again and again and again across the world when cases of abuse
that was shameful, and the Catholics who have done that are absolutely shameful. And as a Catholic, I feel very ashamed of that.
But if it had been up to the Catholic Church and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which sought to enforce secrecy in the dealing with these issues, we would never have even known that.
Well, that's
you wouldn't even
be
sitting there apologising and expressing shame.
That's not true. The Catholic Church, and certainly not the Vatican, has never enforced secrecy on this point in terms of to the civil authorities or to anyone. What the secrecy I think you're referring to are 3 documents that people on the Protest the Pope website keep on referring to and have evidently never read, or if they've never read it, they've never properly understood it. The kind of secrecy that is referred to in these documents, one being Crimis Stationis, which is a document written in 1962, one being De Delictis Gravioribus, which is a letter sent by this Pope when he was Cardinal Ratzinger to the many bishops of the world. The secrecy referred to there is the confidentiality in canon law tribunals. That does not mean, for example, let's take a practical case. If you're someone who's been sexually abused, and there are witnesses to that sexual abuse, or even if there aren't, if you go to the bishop, the bishop can, under canon law, tell, and he should tell, if in certain countries like ours, rather than totalitarian dictatorships, in which they shouldn't, but nonetheless, they should tell the relevant authorities, and they can do.
That's mentioned in these documents.
No, I'm saying that the secrecy...
Exactly, it's not in those documents. It doesn't say in these documents that should be done,
it can't do that, because the canon law actually refers to the entire Catholic Church across the world. And you can't simply say in every single country, without exception, if you seek sexual abuse related to the authorities. What about those countries?
Then why can't you say in a certain number of countries related to the
authorities? Well, in those countries there are policies, like in England. In England and Wales, if you find sexual abuse, you must report it to the authorities. So we don't need the government. The canon law is supposed to be there for the whole universal Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church can and does, in individual countries like liberal democracies, say you must report it to the police. The secrecy referred to there is that when you have a tribunal... There are two laws here we're talking about. Civil law, which is the state and the police and all those sorts of people, and the bishop should report the sexual abuse to those people. Then there's also canon law. Canon law deals with the church and its own procedures. It doesn't deal with whether we lock these people up or report them to the police. It deals with whether we laicize them, and in those and other things. So in those cases, there is a confidentiality kept when the accusation is made. That's for the preservation of the reputation of a priest. This isn't if he's found guilty, by the way. This is just during the case. During the case, when this is happening, when this is being investigated, rather than having everyone told that this is going on, we protect the preservation, the reputation of the priest who may or may not be guilty, the reputation of the person who's been abused or who is claiming to be abused, the witnesses. All of these secrecy does not, it's confidentiality. It's not really a secrecy or a cover-up of sexual abuse that has happened for the civil authorities. Well, it's simply saying confidentiality to protect
culture of secrecy.
I'll ask your response to be your summing up as well here, Andrew. So I mean, we've heard a lot of what you would call attempts at justification of the various things that have happened under the Catholic Church, the ills, if you like. In the course of the programme, Peter's never, he doesn't countenance any of these things, but he says you have to moderate these things with, looking at in their context and the fact that in the wider sweep of things, the Catholic Church has done a huge amount of good in the world. I mean, any institution is bound to be imperfect. Does it make
Everything's
sense?
Bound to be imperfect.
Yeah, but I mean, does that...
doesn't mean we can't strive to be better.
Absolutely, but I mean, in that sense, I'm asking, is it justified, this attack on the Catholic Church from secular sources, from the Protest the Pope campaign, etc.?
Protest the Pope campaign is not attacking the Catholic Church. People who apologists like to...
The people behind the campaign are not exactly big fans of the Church, though,
well, don't you think there's a difference between not being a fan of something and attacking it? I mean, you can't slide too easily into that sort of inflammatory remark, I think.
All right, but granted that, I mean, for you, do any of Peter's justifications hold water? Do you, at the end of the day, has he managed to persuade you that the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world?
No. And in fact, his arguments have made me think the worst of the arguments that are frequently made. I think that... I'm surprised, actually. I think that it's odd to treat this sort of question with the sort of defensiveness, the sort of closed-mindedness and the sort of attempt to play down murder and torture in the past as if it's not that bad. Oh, the Spanish Inquisition didn't torture that many people, didn't kill that many people, I think is an appalling thing to say. Only our distance from that human suffering can enable people to make statements like that. And the fact that people do make statements like that, I think, just shows that they've ignored the reality of that human suffering in the past. I think to say, well, of course, people will never be able to, if they're not religious or if they're not Catholics, people will never be able to really understand the truth and the true moral justifications for all these things that are done, is not an argument that is acceptable in debate. It's not a justification. I think there can be no justification for lots of the great harms that the Catholic Church has done across time, and they are not only historical. They're not only about the torture and execution of so many people, the closing of minds, the great interruption of Western civilization that the Catholic Church represents, and the impoverishment of both our ethics and our reason over those centuries, but also the practices today. The frustration of international justice and of national justice in the case of child abuse within the Church, the aggravation of the spread of AIDS, the denial of reproductive and sexual health rights like condoms, like abortion, to even the most vulnerable people. All those things are great crimes that stand against the Catholic Church, and I think with the good that the Catholic Church does being merely incidental to its Catholic nature rather than anything else, they probably, I'm persuaded by the last hour, which I wasn't at the beginning, that it is more of a force for bad than it is a force for good, and the sort of dogmatic and ideological arguments that I've heard have only made that case stronger.
Peter,
well, I think
thought.
After this hour, I'm certainly more convinced that humanists have absolutely no case for saying anything is good or bad at all, and that's the case I tried to bring at the very beginning. I certainly think it's true that as Catholics and as Christians, we believe that humanity is fallen, and that all people are fallen and are imperfect, and that includes Catholics. I'm not a Catholic because I believe in Catholics. I'm not a Catholic because I think that Catholics have always been perfect or have always done brilliant, wonderful things. A lot of them have. I mean, the Catholic Church is the foundation for modern science, it's the foundation for modern ethics, it's the foundation for the modern state, it's the foundation for modern Western civilization. It essentially generated Western civilization, whether the atheists like it or not. And I think looking at history, I have never justified torture, I've never justified sexual abuse, I've never justified any of this sort of stuff. What I have said is that it was appalling, but we do see it in its historical context, and I don't think it's justified. I think it is a squalid manoeuvre to try to say that the exaggerations of these evils are in some way, and to deny that the exaggerations of these evils are true, is in some way a justification for them. But what Andrew has failed to argue is why how the Church in some way exacerbates the HIV/AIDS situation in Africa. He has failed to show how we in any way impoverish ethics. He's failed to give us a grounding for ethics. And I think he's also failed just to actually argue why the idea of secrecy within the documents that he was referring to, or he'd never even discussed them, in any way suggests that the Church has tried to, on an international level, so-called cover up sexual abuse. It, in fact, has not done that. The sexual abuse that has happened has been absolutely, utterly terrible and appalling. But the Vatican has not in any way tried to cover it up. Cover-ups have happened in the Church. Where they were, we condemn them utterly, and justice must be done. But the Vatican has been leading the way, and certainly this Pope has been leading the way, in reforming the Church and making sure that its principles, which have generated so much good in the world and are the central source of good in the world, actually are kept faithfully by Catholics.
We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. I know you want to respond, Andrew, but the time constraints won't allow us to do that. Perhaps we'll have a round two at some point in the not-too-distant future. But we'll thank you for listening, and I'll be bringing you some of the feedback to this particular episode. If you want to get in touch, I'll be giving you the ways you can do that in just a moment's time.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Phew. Well, it got pretty heated, didn't it? But if you want to get in touch and add your own voice to the voices of Peter and Andrew, then I do encourage you to email me. That's unbelievable@premier.org.uk. You can also phone and leave me a voicemail message, 08456 52 52 52, and select option 8. Don't forget, this programme available now as a podcast. Do visit the web page and many more programmes beside. I'll put some links up to some relevant programmes as well there. premier.org.uk/unbelievable. You can get the podcast. You can download us regularly. It's all possible. You can click through to other features, programmes, and indeed the Premier community where these issues are discussed by some of the forum members. So that's the place to go, premier.org.uk/unbelievable. Thank you for all the emails that have been coming in. Sorry I never get the chance to really do justice to them these days. The level of correspondence has really gone up in the last year or so, I can tell you. Last week, of course, I was mentioning the headlines surrounding Stephen Hawking, declaring that God has been, if you like, squeezed out of the equations when it comes to the beginning of the universe. Simply no need for a God to light the blue touch paper, as he put it. And, well, we've had a little bit of interaction from you on that, and there's plenty of other places on the web you could find people's opinions on this. But we're going to be doing a definitive programme responding to that whole area with Alistair McGrath in a few weeks. Alistair McGrath, of course, a well-known figure in the whole debate of science and faith. He's head of theology at King's College in London, and a well-known apologist in his own right. So exciting to have him on the programme. I'll bring you more details of that programme in the future. Let's just read this one from Matthew Codd on the whole issue. He says, it's funny how things happen sometimes, with Stephen Hawking sticking his oar in again. Now he seems to think that gravity can create the universe out of nothing, although he doesn't seem to have asked himself where the law of gravity came from. As somebody once said, In the beginning was Logos. And a little poem you've included here as well, Matthew. Looking up on a starry night, contemplating, feeling small, whence the laws that we discover? Why do they exist at all? Also, in a previous email, you were talking about the fact that scientists have proved that the universe is going to expand forever, ending up as a cold, dead void. You say, I don't think it's possible to overstate the significance of this discovery. It means that the old bang crunch theory, which neatly avoided the need for a beginning, has been ruled out. Now scientists are going to have to explain how something can come from nothing. Well, obviously you feel that Stephen Hawking has not done a good job philosophically on that front. So we'll be looking at those issues with Alistair McGrath and a guest as yet to be confirmed for that discussion in a few weeks' time. Let me also go to some of your responses now to last week's programme. We were talking about the soul, and we had Christian physicalist Glenn Peoples with us. Doesn't believe in a soul, Glenn. Says he's still a Christian, an Orthodox evangelical Christian, no less. He was in conversation with theologian and philosopher John Haldane. Now, when we looked at this, a few different responses coming in. Let me play you some of the voicemail messages we received first of all.
What strikes me about the programme is that neither of your contributors appear to be Christians. The Australian Blake comments about the soul seem to be completely ridiculous, because the soul, as far as I in the Oxford English Dictionary understands it, is the mind, the intellect and the emotional part of the human being, which has spiritual connotations. What he's really, what fundamentally survives us after death is the spirit. I found the conversation completely, really incomprehensible. Truth does not reside in complexity, but in simplicity.
My name is Catherine Scott from Edinburgh, and I was surprised that nobody mentioned the quotation from Luke, chapter 24, verse 43, when Jesus said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." That would indicate, I would think, that he would expect to be in heaven straight away, and that the dying priest to whom the remark was addressed would also be with him straight away. But thank you for a very interesting discussion.
Two quite different responses there. Hugh, who was the guy who left that first message, obviously feeling we didn't have a Christian on the programme. Funny that, because, I mean, obviously Glenn, in every other respect, apart from his view on the soul, describes himself as categorically an evangelical Christian, has no problem with it. So I don't know whether you just simply believe that having a different view of the soul, that it isn't a physical thing, that it is essentially we are purely material, disqualifies someone from Christian faith. Obviously you felt the same way about John Haldane, presumably because of his Catholic faith, but either way, I felt that it wasn't exactly a show in which there were no Christians involved. In fact, it's kind of the opposite, the show where only Christians were involved on my reading of it, but obviously different to yours, Hugh. Thank you also to that lady from Scotland who rang as well. Let's just go to a quick email. This actually came in from Chris Date before that programme went out, but he has an interesting little story to say that until recently, Chris says, I was 100% sold on dualism, or perhaps what might properly be called a dichotomy view of man, which holds that we are comprised of both a material body and an immaterial soul. And it was only when I came into contact with Glenn Peoples and his blog that I argued with him about it at a blog where we both guest write. However, the more I discussed it with him and the more I've dug deeply into Scripture, the more I've begun to shift towards the proverbial fence, atop which I sit right now. So you say you were looking forward to that debate. I hope it lived up to your expectations, Chris. Let me know what you thought about it now that it's gone out. You also wanted to weigh in on another subject, Chris. This is a listener named David who wrote into a show a while back now asking two questions. One, why is there no universal religion, which I presume to mean one that everybody accepts? And secondly, how can those who've never heard the gospel be punished in hell for not believing in something with which, through no fault of their own, they've never been presented? And here's what you'd like to say in response to those questions. I believe the answer to both questions is ultimately the same, namely, we're by nature sinful in opposition towards God. You see, why is there no religion for which everybody accepts? Well, because we sin constantly, a reflection of our sinful nature, from which we reject the truth about God. And it is that for which we are punished in hell without Christ, being sinners. We're punished because we sin, not because we have not accepted the gospel. Whether one is presented with the gospel and rejects it, or never hears the gospel to begin with, one receives justice in the form of punishment for their sin. But for those who have been presented with the gospel and accept forgiveness through Jesus Christ, who died for those sins which earned us punishment, we are shown mercy and are forgiven our sins. So nobody receives injustice. We are either justly punished for our sins or are mercifully forgiven through them through Christ. I see where you're coming from, Chris, but I'm not sure that your answer would satisfy many people who feel that there's still, a gap there. And of course, a popular answer that many people would put forward is that God's justice, if you like, there is room made for those who have not heard the gospel, had an opportunity, if you like, people who haven't rejected the gospel because they haven't heard the gospel. Now, how that would work out in practice is, of course, an open question, but if you've got an answer, you're welcome to email me in. Okay, let's move on to some other topics. A couple of weeks ago now, we discussed original sin. We were doing that with Peter Byram, nearly Christian, and also with Peter Sanlon, formerly of Cambridge, moving to London to be a tutor at Oak Hill Theological College, and Professor Norman Nevin on the phone from Ireland. So a number of you responded to this in various ways. Again, people picking me up on my, I'd like to say deliberate, but it wasn't, honestly, mistake that I mentioned an apple in the Garden of Eden. It was, of course, no apple is mentioned, only fruit, says Martin Ploughboy, who wanted to correct me on that one. Andrew in southeast London says it should be known that the doctrine of original sin, in the form outlined by your guest, was not held prior to Augustine. It's not held by the Eastern Orthodox Church, and is not held by many evangelicals, particularly some Arminians and open theists and liberals. In my view, the Augustinian doctrine is horrendous. The doctrine implies that all humans are born condemned and guilty by no original act of their own. How unjust and unfair to be automatically condemned to hell by virtue of one's birth. This view also says that the one sin of Adam, which God knew would occur beforehand, most Christians would say, or even ordained to occur, as Calvinists would say, that this transgression brought earthquakes, floods, diseases, death and suffering into the world. Isn't this overkill to the max? Original sin teaches that all subsequent human beings inherit a nature that leads them to sin, and then in turn God responds by getting angry at their behaviour. What kind of God is this to respond to humanity in this way from a decision by the first humans? Why put a choice like that in the first place that would reap this havoc? It just doesn't make sense to me, especially when the response to inheriting original sin for billions of people who are non-elect or just plain unsaved people is to spend an eternity of suffering and pain in hell which God created. What need does the world have for a Satan when people believe in a God like this? So you say, Andrew, that this form of the doctrine of original sin should be rejected out of hand. And thank God there are alternative Christian understandings. Helen in North London says, a listener asked the question about why did Adam and Eve choose to eat the fruit? Was there something wrong with them? The Bible tells us that the reason they chose to disobey God and eat the fruit was because it looked good for food, pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom. Proverbs 3:5 helps us understand what happened back then in the garden when it urges us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Adam and Eve leaned on their own understanding about what was good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom, instead of trusting wholeheartedly in God. Times haven't changed, and Adam and Eve's children today, all of us, still face the same challenges. Do we do things because they feel, look, and sound so good they must be right? Or do we trust what God says is right for us, even if we're tempted to think it's foolish? The good news is that Jesus' death on the cross was so sufficient that it not only paid for Adam and Eve's first sin, but also for every other sin that has ever been committed. Thank you very much indeed for those responses to that programme. Again, it's available, of course, at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. You can go back a couple of weeks in the archive there and listen to that programme. Going back to an earlier programme again, Emma wanted to weigh in on the euthanasia debate that we had. George Pitcher and Sarah Wooten were our studio guests. She says, I'm a podcast listener from Sydney in Australia. Hello there, Emma, out in Australia. I'm writing in for the first time. I'm against euthanasia for theological, practical and societal reasons, but I found myself sympathising with Sarah Wootton. I don't agree with her argument, which places the rights of individuals above all others, but I did find the anti-euthanasia guest George Pitcher incredibly rude. Sarah clearly knew her stuff and expressed herself well. George didn't listen, interrupted, lost his cool and made me want to apologise to Sarah on behalf of the Christian community. He gave me the impression his passion for this particular cause outweighs his passion for Christ and showing Christ's love. I hope I am wrong, says Emma. And moving on again to another few emails, and these are more sort of in the realm of general emails. Let's just quickly have one more. This is from Austin, who says, Hi Justin, I'm from Texas, and I just wanted to let you know that your show is extremely entertaining. Before listening to your show, I would search for debates on YouTube, which proved to be quite dull and boring. After searching through iTunes for a bit, I stumbled upon your show and was instantly hooked. Thanks for the job you do at hosting, mediating. You seem to understand exactly where each side is coming from, what they're saying, and can summarise their argument in simple terms for the listeners. Just a great show overall. And you say you'd like to see Ray Comfort debate Richard Dawkins. Well, if I could make that happen, then I would probably have miraculous powers and the whole argument about whether God exists would have been settled anyway. But thank you anyway, Austin, and thanks for listening. Thank you for listening wherever you are, in the UK or abroad, listening somewhere on the internet. It's great to have the following of both Christians and non-Christians of Unbelievable, and you're always welcome to send me a line, tell me what you think of the show. We'll be bringing you more feedback next week, and of course do send in your comments on today's show. We were looking at the rights and wrongs of the Catholic Church and whether it's a force for good in the world. And we're continuing in the vein of looking at the Catholic Church at the same time next week.
You're unbelievable.
It's a theological discussion. We're asking, what about the doctrine of papal authority in Catholicism in the light of the visit of Pope Benedict XVI to the UK? We'll be looking at the whole issue of the Catholic doctrine that the Pope is, if you like, God's spokesperson on earth. And to do that, we'll have William Johnstone, who's a Catholic priest. He's going to be in debate with Duncan Boyd of the Protestant Truth Society, so you can probably tell where he's coming from. Do hope you can join me for that programme at the same time next week, here on the show that gets you thinking unbelievable, every Saturday 2:30 till 4, and online at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. See you next time. Welcome along. It's Saturday afternoon. I'm Justin Briley, your host for the next hour and a half here on Premier Christian Radio, with the programme Unbelievable, bringing together Christians and non-Christians as usual for discussion and debate. But plenty more to come on Premier this afternoon. If you want to listen in after 4 o'clock, you'll find Dave and B with Hip Rock UK, the latest in youth news and Christian music. So do stay tuned for that. You may be listening, though, online via our podcast. That's at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. You're very welcome as well. Well, it's an exciting week coming up for Catholics in the UK as Pope Benedict XVI visits on an official state visit, but there are people who aren't so happy about the fact that he's here at the taxpayers' expense. We're going to be meeting one of them in the course of today's programme, and a young Catholic apologist. Let me introduce you to them now.
You're unbelievable.
We're debating on the programme today, is the Catholic Church a force for good or evil in the world? A similar proposal was debated at Westminster Central Hall at an Intelligence Squared debate between people like Stephen Fry, Christopher Hitchens, Anne Widdecombe, and a Catholic Archbishop, that was Oni Aiken. So we're looking at the question afresh today and asking, what about the things that the Catholic Church is accused of in regards to child abuse, attitudes towards HIV/AIDS in Africa, past historic torture, things like that. Is there any defence for these things? Can, if you like, the Catholic Church be called a force for good in the world? We'll be hearing in the course of today's programme from the British Humanist Association Director Andrew Copson, who's also part of the Protest the Pope coalition. He says the Catholic Church is not overall a force for good in the world. We'll also be hearing from Peter D. Williams. He's a young Catholic apologist. He is a theologian, and he's part of the Catholic Voices group, who are, if you like, providing media-friendly spokespersons in support of the Catholic Church in the time that Pope Benedict XVI is visiting the country. They're my guests on the programme today as we look at this question, whether the Catholic Church is a force for good or evil in the world. Well, I've been looking forward to this debate, gentlemen, because obviously it's a big thing with the Pope arriving in the UK in the coming week. And obviously you've both got different, presumably, views on his arrival. It might be interesting to start off with that a little bit in this programme before we get into the meat of this question of, is the Catholic Church a force for good or evil in the world? But let's meet our guest today, first of all. Peter D. Williams. We've had to make clear which Peter Williams you are, because there are two other Peter Williams who have contributed in the past to this programme. I don't know
far
whether
less unique, yeah.
Christian apologists must, sort of have a preference for their names. But anyway, Peter, thank you for joining us. A little bit about yourself. I read on this Catholic Voices website that you're part of the team of that, that you're a atheist revert to the Catholic faith. What might that mean exactly?
Well, I was brought up Catholic. My mother's devout Catholic, my dad's sort of agnostic / atheist. And I suppose a lot of people during the whole second decade of their life, including the 20s, and then just sort of have a time of questioning, really, and sort of doubting. But I became an atheist for a brief period because I thought, well, if there's no God, really, then there's no ultimate consequences to anything I do. Brilliant, I can do what I like. And, I realise that that's a very selfish point of view. Not every atheist would think that way. But that was the reason that I had for being an atheist. And it was essentially moral nihilism. But I wasn't able to completely follow it, because I eventually realised that, well, look, if you're going to believe that, if you want to say that there's no such thing as absolute morality, then really there's nothing intrinsically wrong with anything. Rape, torture, genocide, the Holocaust, child abuse, whatever's your big evil, it's not intrinsically wrong. It's wrong because you think it is. It's wrong because society tells you it is, or the culture or the state or whatever magisterium you happen to subscribe to. But there's nothing intrinsically wrong or transcendentally wrong about it. And I couldn't accept that. And that sort of to put the nail in the coffin of my atheism.
The moral argument for God, then, really was
that
sort
was
of where
very
it came
persuasive
from.
to me. That's not the only argument that's persuasive, but that's what started me off.
We will actually be doing that in some detail in a couple of weeks' time with two philosophers. But anyway, that's a separate issue. Now, of course, you've, as it were, committed your life to Christianity, to the Catholic faith in particular. What did you make of this debate that took place about a year ago? There was this Intelligence Squared debate, debating this very question, is the Catholic Church a force for good? The panellists were Anne Widdecombe, of course, well-known MP, and has a Catholic faith of her own, Archbishop Oni Akin, who's an African Archbishop of the Catholic Church, and they were against Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Fry. Many people say though it was very unevenly matched. The Catholics weren't represented well. People, What did you make of it?
I think calling it a debate is quite generous, actually. I enjoy debates. I've watched a lot of debates. And I think a real debate includes, the first propositions, or proposition and then negation, then rebuttal, then cross-examination period, which is very fruitful, then another rebuttal, and then the ending statements. And then I think you can have, if you want, audience questions. In this case, what you had were 4 statements, no rebuttal. The small amount of rebuttal there was during
of the Holy See, in any case, more of a convenient fiction to amplify the Vatican's voice on the international stage. But either way, we think that a state visit which is publicly funded should not be accorded to the head of a state that does such harm on the international stage. And we protested about the King of Saudi Arabia, for example, coming on a state visit here when he came too with a protest outside the Saudi embassy on that occasion. So this isn't a particularly new thing. It's made particularly relevant, more relevant, I suppose, because of the fact that he is the head of a state that, by any reckoning, isn't a real state anyway. And the Holy See's activities in relation to frustrating sexual health and reproductive rights on the international level, frustrating human rights for gay people and so on, are the sort of things that we object to.
We'll be talking about those things, I imagine, in the programme today. Yeah. But, before we get into that, it might be just interesting to get a response from you, Peter, there. And you obviously wholeheartedly support the visit. Sure. And what do you make of the protest, the Pope's reasons for why they feel that this shouldn't have been a state-funded, at very least, visit?
Well, to begin with, I think the problem is that the Vatican City is different from the Holy See. There are two different entities here. Vatican City was, in fact, generated in 1929 as an entity. It's a square mile of real estate really owned by the Holy See. And the Holy See is is essentially what the Pope is the head of. And that's actually the oldest international organisation on the planet. It's a state, whether Andrew likes it or not, and has been recognised by 200 countries, as it is today, and has observer status on the UN. So this is a state whether we like it or not, and it represents not just... It is a unique institution, actually. I mean, it's not simply representing the few people who live in Vatican City, that square mile I just referred to, but rather the billions of Catholics who live on the planet. So this is a unique institution. It's not irrelevant. It's not something that is the same as, say, the Dalai Lama. Or
didn't say it was irrelevant.
I didn't say so. You did say it was irrelevant. Some people, I think, do think it's irrelevant because they feel
it's
religion's
a very
relevant.
great relevance,
but
unfortunately.
But yeah, it is a state whether they like it or not. And the second, of course, objection that Andrew has, we're going to be going into in terms of what they have as a problem with the Church's doctrines, teachings, and practices.
That's not true.
And the teaching on homosexuality.
No, what we have a problem with is that doctrine being promulgated on an international level as if by a state. And I've personally seen the Holy See acting in the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe or the United Nations, and the way that it behaves as a state to amplify purely doctrinal religious beliefs as a state is what we object to.
So
we don't object.
Question and answer period from the floor, from the audience questions, and then they had the voting whilst the ending statements were going on. And this was a ridiculous way to go about a debate. It doesn't actually enlighten anyone. It was much more heat than light, in fact. And in fact, I think Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Fry really show that what they didn't know about the Catholic Church rather outweighed what they did know about it. And so many of their criticisms were at straw men. It's very generous to call it a debate at all.
I mean, in a way, that is the way that these intelligence squared debate, if you call them that, happen. They have a looser kind of framework than, if you like, the very sort of tied down type of debate format. But I appreciate that does have problems in terms of people being able to formally reply to something. Nonetheless, I think the main problem that a lot of people seem to have with it was the quality of the candidates who were fielded. I mean, for you, is that an issue?
I think that, there's an interesting article by Christopher Lamb in the Tablet last November about this, that of the reasons why they chose the people they chose, and that in fact Archbishop John Onyeakin was chosen precisely because someone bumped into him in an elevator. It wasn't really very well planned, this debate. I mean, actually Christopher Hitchens was saying we should really have someone like Dinesh D'Souza, who's a very sort of high-level Catholic apologist in America. So I think it could have been better organised and better structured. But yeah, my only quarrel, I suppose, my only problem with the Archbishop would have really been his presentation. I think he was stunningly under-ambitious when he was talking about why the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world. It seemed to be he was saying it's because we do a lot of charity work, and we do a lot of charity work. That's a very important part of the evangelization of the world, is actually to bring the kingdom of God, and that means social justice. But it's far beyond that why we believe that we are not only a force for good in the world, but the greatest force for good in the world.
Well,
so
we'll hear some of the excerpts that I've brought along with me for this programme of that debate. Not that is, if you like, not that we're simply reviewing that debate. We're having a debate of our own, but it might at least stimulate some of our thoughts and reflections as well. Andrew, thank you for joining us again on the programme. This must be the third or fourth time that you've come on the programme, so thank you very much for being with me. Andrew, you are the director of the British Humanist Association. Perhaps more pertinently in this case, though, part of this Protest the Pope coalition. Tell me, why are the British Humanist Association protesting the Pope's visit to the UK?
Well, although we think that as a religious leader and a European citizen, German citizen, he has every right to come to this country and to tour it, we don't think that he should be accorded the honour and recognition of a state visit. We consider the statehood of the Vatican, obviously, to a large religion, having doctrine and promulgating those things. That's what religions do. I object to them using their status as a state to advance those things.
Well, as I say, the Catholic Church is a unique institution, and the Holy See is a unique institution. And what you're essentially saying is you object to the Holy See putting forward its values and its beliefs on the international stage.
As a state,
well,
yes.
The British government does that. The American government.
Britain is a state, and America is a state.
The Holy See is a state.
It is
like
not a
it or
state.
not. It is a state, whether you like it or not.
Well,
it's recognised by 200 governments.
To say that lots of people think that something is the case is not the same to say it is the case. You say that 200 states recognise the Holy See as a state. Well, maybe, but that doesn't mean that it should be a state, or that it is a state, or that treating it as a state is right. That's no evidence for that position.
Well, obviously, I'm not here in this way, we could spend the whole programme debating the rights and wrongs of the Pope's visit being treated as a state visit. But we're not here to do that, and lots of other people are doing that, and there are many places you can find online other debates going on in that regard. But today, we want to look at the bigger question that, if you like, goes on whether the Pope is visiting our country or not. Is the Catholic Church a force for good or evil in the world? Of course, our headlines have been full in the last few years of lots of lurid headlines about Catholic priests, abuse, child abuse, obviously the whole issue about the approach of the Catholic Church to AIDS and HIV and condoms in Africa is a recurrent one. And many other things besides. We'll, as I say, be hearing a few inserts during the programme from what Christopher Hitchens, Stephen Fry, Anne Widdecombe and Archbishop Onyekun had to say on the matter at that Intelligence Squared debate of last year. And we welcome your input as well. If you'd like to drop me an email in response to today's programme, you're more than welcome to do that at unbelievable@premier.org.uk. Again, that's unbelievable@premier.org.uk.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Perhaps we'll start off then with hearing from some of these speakers that we had. This first clip comes from Archbishop Onyekun, who is a Catholic archbishop, and we'll hear him explaining now why he believes that one of the major factors for the belief that the Catholic Church is a force for good is simply the vast amount of humanitarian work that goes on across the globe.
Independent statistics have shown that the Catholic Church is doing far more than its numbers and its population would probably